Hello and welcome back to another Mr. Carter Science Specials. This time round we're going to be looking at the digestive system. As always, keep your eye out for the syllabus references so you know where you are in your course, and follow my general advice, which is make certain you're pausing these videos often, making your own notes, trying the revision questions and then reviewing your answers. Remember, learning should be active. The more you're doing, the more you're learning. So before we get on to looking at the organs of the digestive system, first of all, we need to consider 7 very important key words. And these words have very specific meanings, but they are easy to confuse. So you need to be able to memorize each meaning and use them and apply them in your exams. So the first one is ingestion. And that's when food and nutrients enter your mouth. So ingestion. And if food and nutrients are entering your body, of course, you have to have some waste leaving your body. And that's called egestion. So how do you remember this? Well, ingestion is when we go in, and egestion is when we exit, and go out. So egestion is undigested food, which is removed via the anus as feces or poo. In between, we have digestion. So what happens in digestion? Well, digestion is where we take large insoluble molecules and break them down into small soluble molecules. So large insoluble molecules such as starch, protein, and fat. And we break these down into much smaller soluble molecules. So the starch gets broken down into smaller sugars, glucose and maltose. Protein gets broken down into amino acids, and fats get broken down into glycerol and fatty acids. Once we've broken down these molecules, they are soluble, so they can dissolve in water. And the next phase can happen, which is absorption. And that's when these small soluble molecules can diffuse from the small intestine into the blood and be carried around the body. Once these small molecules, the amino acids, the amino acids and the sugars and the fatty acids and glycerol, once they're being carried around the body in the blood, we then have the next step, which is assimilation, where these small food molecules are rearranged and used to build the large molecules used by the body. So in particular, amino acids, for example, will be joined up in very specific orders to make the proteins that you need in your body. Proteins like amino acids, proteins like muscle proteins that you need when you're building muscle, proteins like enzymes that you need for digestion. And then, of course, any food which you have not absorbed, which you haven't been able to digest, is egested as feces. But you've got to be very careful with this word egestion, because egestion is very different from excretion. And now excretion is when your body gets rid of waste products made by the body. So for example, your body makes urea, your body makes sweat, your body makes carbon dioxide, and it needs to get rid of all of these in various different forms of excretion. So excretion is very different from egestion. So when you urinate, you get rid of urea that you've made, and that's excretion. When you go and have a poo, you get rid of feces that you did not make. It's just the leftovers from the meal that you had. All the goodness, all the large insoluble molecules you've been able to break down and digest, they've all been removed from your meal. Whatever's left, which tends to be the fibers, the cellulose that you can't break down, that comes out as poo, and that's just egestion. So let's try a few review questions very quickly. Pause the video right now, have a think. How much have you remembered? Can you remember those key definitions? And we're not looking for you to understand, or we're just looking for a very short memorization of those key sentences. So pause the video now, try and write those down. So here are the answers. Hopefully you've spent some time pausing the video and writing down these answers so that you understand. Ingestion is the food and nutrients entering the mouth. Digestion is large insoluble molecules are broken down into small soluble molecules. Absorption is when the small soluble molecules diffuse from the small intestine into the blood. Assimilation is when the food molecules, the amino acids, glucose, glycerol and fatty acids, are rearranged and used to build large molecules used by the body. Egestion is the undigested food that's removed via the anus as feces. And finally, I asked you to compare egestion and excretion. Well, egestion is the removal of undigested food, but excretion is removal of waste products made by the body, the urea, sweat and carbon dioxide. So let's look at the 5 key organs of the digestive system, and we'll start in the mouth. So in the mouth you have teeth that grind and chop up food into small pieces, but you might be asked in an exam to explain why. Why do the teeth do that? Well, this is to increase the surface area of the food so that enzymes can digest food faster. In any kind of chemistry or biology, when we're looking at rates of reaction and chemical reactions, if we have a larger surface area of the reactants, of the chemicals in the reaction, you're going to get a faster rate of reaction. So it's very important that our enzymes can work quickly, and we want to have a large surface area for our food. We also have in the mouth the first of our enzymes that we come across. We have an enzyme called amylase, and amylase has the function of breaking down starch. So one of the ways we can prove this is if you take a piece of bread which has a lot of starch in it and you put it in your mouth and you chew and you chew and you chew, but don't swallow. If you leave it in your mouth for about 10 minutes or so, it will begin to taste sweet because your enzyme amylase is breaking down the starch and producing sugars, and your tongue can taste those sugars. So once you've swallowed your food will go down into the gullet or the esophagus. It's got 2 names, and this is a tube that links the mouth to the stomach. But at the top of this tube there is a flat muscle just about here called the epiglottis. The epiglottis spends most of its time covering the esophagus, preventing any food from going down the esophagus, but it opens up the trachea and allows air to enter and leave the lungs. But when you swallow, that epiglottis will flip and cover the opposite way, so it will cover the trachea, stopping and preventing food from entering your lungs and allowing that food to go down your esophagus, and this will stop you from choking. It's a very important muscle. When the food reaches the stomach, we have 2 key processes that happen in the stomach. Firstly, we have stomach acid, and the stomach acid will destroy any microorganisms that are on your food and keep you safe from diseases like food poisoning. But we will also have enzymes in the stomach that will digest proteins. So the enzyme that's in the stomach is a protease. There's a couple of different proteases. Trypsin is one example, pectin is another example, and these protease enzymes, they break down proteins. So the only chemical, the only molecule that's digested in your stomach is protein. It's a very common misconception. A lot of students tend to think that everything is digested in your stomach. Well, that's wrong. The stomach acid destroys microorganisms, and the protease enzymes break down protein, and that's all that happens in your stomach. In fact, the majority of your digestion actually takes place in the small intestine, which is just here. And the small intestine produces a range of enzymes. It produces amylase to break down starch, spell that correctly. So the small intestine produces amylase, which will break down starch. It produces a range of protease enzymes to break down protein, and it produces lipase enzymes, which will break down fat. Once we've broken down these large insoluble molecules, they can be absorbed into the blood through the wall of the small intestine. And we'll talk about in a moment how the small intestine is adapted to absorb these molecules as quickly as possible. The final organ is the large intestine, in black, or the colon. And the function of the large intestine is just to absorb water and store waste until the time it's ready to pass out of your body through the anus. So this is the large intestine that wraps around the small intestine. Interestingly, the large intestine is actually quite short in length. It's known as the large intestine though because its diameter is very, very wide, and the small intestine has a small diameter, a very narrow diameter. So let's now look at that small intestine in more detail. What's going on in there? Well, the first thing we need to know is that it's a very long tube, as I was just suggesting, and you can see that here. And that tube has a lot of muscles in its wall. And if we imagine these muscles are all linked together, and they will contract in a wave. So you have contraction 1, 2, and 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on. They will contract in a wave following on from each other. That wave of contraction is called peristalsis, and the peristalsis, or the contractions of the muscle, will squeeze and push the food down the small intestine towards the large intestine and then eventually to be digested. So, as I said previously, there's an awful lot of digestion that goes on in the small intestine. We've got enzymes that can break down all the 3 large insoluble molecules and break them into small soluble molecules. So it needs to have a lot of adaptations to help it absorb the food faster. The first thing you'll notice is this tube is lined with lots of small little projections which go up and down, up and down, up and down. In fact, I've got a slightly zoomed in version there of these projections going up and down. And you'll notice that they're called villus, one villus or many villi. And inside these villi, there's lots of blood vessels so that they can absorb the food molecules and then carry them around your body. But if we actually look carefully over here, we've got another diagram of a villi, and you can see that those villi are lined with little cells. And if we zoom in on each one of those cells of the villi, each cell has lots and lots of microvilli. And again, the reason for the villi and the microvilli is to give the small intestine a very large surface area, because a large surface area will speed up the rate of diffusion. We have a very high concentration of molecules in the small intestine and a low concentration of these molecules in the blood, so the majority of them will diffuse from the small intestine into the blood. So anything that the small intestine can have to speed up the rates of diffusion will help it be adapted to its function. So we have a large surface area provided by the villi and the microvilli. The walls of the villi are just 1 cell thick, which provides a very short distance for diffusion, again speeding up diffusion. And we also have a high amount of blood within each villi, and that blood will carry away the nutrients as soon as they've diffused in, and this maintains the diffusion gradient, or maintains the concentration gradient, again making certain that we can have a fast rate of diffusion. You'll also notice that there is this yellow structure inside, which is called a lacteal, and the function of a lacteal is to help absorb glycerol and fatty acids. But some students don't like having a large paragraph to read through, so I've got the same information here as bullet points. So we have the villi and the microvilli, which provide a large surface area for fast diffusion. The villi have thin walls for a short diffusion distance, which again provides for a fast rate of diffusion. The good blood supply maintains the diffusion gradient, or the concentration gradient, and again gives us a fast rate of diffusion. Each one of those could be 3 marks or 1 mark each in any exam. We could also mention that the small intestine is adapted because it has a lacteal to help it absorb fatty acids and glycerol. But we don't just have to consider diffusion, we also have active transport that happens in the small intestine. So if we look at these epithelial cells here, you'll notice they have a large number of mitochondria, and these provide a large amount of energy in the form of ATP from respiration, and the ATP is used in active transport to help absorb the nutrients. The epithelial cells, you'll also notice, have some ribosomes, and those ribosomes are used in protein synthesis to make proteins like the enzyme maltase, and maltase digests the sugar maltose. So as the small sugars maltose, there's one. As that maltose diffuses through the epithelial cells, it will be broken down into individual glucose molecules, which can then be absorbed into the blood. There are 3 other organs though that we need to consider. I've shown them here in a nice diagram where you can see the stomach going through into the small intestine. In fact, this first section of the small intestine from about here to here is known as the duodenum. And if you look around this stomach and duodenum, we have here one of the largest organs of the body, the liver. Then we have the gallbladder, and we have the pancreas, which sits just behind the stomach. So what are the functions of those organs? They're not really part of the digestive system, but they do help support the digestive system. So here I've an image which appeared in an exam paper a while ago. And again, it gives you a slightly clearer idea of where those 3 organs are. So we'll start with the liver. The liver makes a chemical called bile. And after the nutrients are absorbed into the blood, they're taken straight to the liver, and some of those nutrients are processed. For example, glucose can be stored, if we've got too much glucose, as a chemical called glycogen, carbohydrate. The liver can also break down any toxins that might be in our food or that we've ingested, for example, alcohol. But let's go back and have a little think about this chemical bile. What is bile? Well, once the liver's made the bile, it gets stored in the gallbladder here. And the gallbladder will then secrete this bile into the small intestine. And the bile is an alkali. So if you think about the stomach contains strong hydrochloric stomach acid. And we need to neutralize that before it enters the small intestine, otherwise it will denature and damage all the enzymes in the small intestine. So bile is an alkali that's used to neutralize the stomach acid, but bile has a second function. It's also an emulsifier. Now, an emulsifier is any chemical which will help to allow fat and water to mix. So if you've done your washing up at home and you've used some washing up liquid, we use that to clean plates because it allows any fatty residue from your food on your plates to mix with the water so we can clean the plates better. Well, bile also has the same function in your small intestine. It will help to break down the fat molecules. So instead of having one large fat molecule, you'll have many small droplets of fat, which will increase the surface area so enzymes can work faster, and therefore your rate of digestion will be faster. We also have our 3rd helping organ, which is called the pancreas. Now, the pancreas will produce many of the enzymes that we need for digestion. It produces amylase and lipase, but it will also produce trypsin and other proteases, and it will secrete them directly into the duodenum, into the small intestine, so that they can then be used in digestion. The pancreas also has a secondary function, that it makes the hormone insulin, which, as you'll see later on in the course, is used to help control blood sugar levels and in conjunction with the liver. So here are a number of review questions. Again, I advise you to pause the video, consider what you've learned, maybe go back over the organs we've just discussed, and then try and answer these questions. I'll give you the answers in a moment. So the answers. The first question says, state the names and the functions of each organ in the digestive system. So we could talk about the mouth, and its function is to grind and chop up food to provide that large surface area for enzymes to work faster. We could talk about the esophagus, which is just a tube that links the mouth to the stomach, but we have the epiglottis at the top, which prevents you from choking. We could talk about the stomach, which has stomach acid to destroy microorganisms and protease enzymes to break down proteins. The small intestine contains a large number of enzymes to break down large insoluble molecules into small soluble molecules. It's got amylase that will break down starch. It has proteases to break down proteins and lipases to break down fats. But ultimately, the function of a small intestine is to break down the large insoluble molecules into small soluble molecules and then absorb them into the blood. We also have the large intestine, and the function of the large intestine is to absorb water and store feces. Describe the function of the liver in terms of digestion. Well, the liver produces bile, and that's also the answer to question 4. The liver produces bile. But the liver also will store and break down many chemicals that come straight from digestion. So it might store any excess glucose, and it will break down any toxins or poisons like alcohol that you've ingested. The organ that stores the bile, that organ is the gallbladder. And the function of the bile is to neutralize the stomach acid, and also emulsify fats. What's the function of the pancreas? In terms of digestion, the pancreas produces enzymes, in particular proteases, amylase and lipases, which are the enzymes produced by the pancreas. So, thank you very much for watching this video. I hope that you've learned something. Make certain you've written some things down and that you consider your learning. I would advise now that you go off, find somebody, have a talk to them and explain to them what you've learned from watching this video, so it stays in your brain and hopefully it's of use for you in your GCSE or IGCSE exams. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you know when the next videos are coming out, and please add any comments below so that I can try and improve these videos. Thank you very much. This has been a Mr. Carter Science Special video on digestion.